Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Royal Asiatic Society Islamic Art Circle book launch. And once again, I must thank Alison and Matty and Amy for kindly hosting this and doing all the mass organisation. It's with great pleasure this evening that our speaker is well known to the Islamic Art Circle. He only lectured about 2 or 3 years ago on puppets and puppet shows. Anyway, Marcus Milwright is Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology in the Department of Art, History and Visual Studies, University of Victoria. He held research fellowships at the Aga Khan programs for Islamic architecture at Harvard and MIT, and the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art at Shangri-La, Honolulu. His research interests are wide and include art and archaeology of the Islamic Middle East, labour and craft practices in the urban environment, and cross-cultural contexts in the medieval Mediterranean. He's involved in archaeological and architectural projects in Jordan, Syria, Greece, and has created the Crafts of Syria website. His books include The Fortress of the Raven, Karak in the Middle Islamic Period, in an introduction to Islamic archaeology, also for Edinburgh University Press, Dome of the Rock and its admired mosaic inscriptions, and it's seemingly endless, his list. But what we're gathered today to hear is learn all about the Queen of Sheba's gift, a history of the true balsam of Matarea, which takes us on a wonderful journey through the whole of history of all these aromatics. Here's a copy of the book, which you can, so help, I'm getting a mirror image, that's what threw me just then, which you can get, I think in the flyer there was a discount code, so I strongly recommend you purchasing it as well. Anyway, he's currently working on the publication of early Islamic pottery from Raqqa, and a website devoted to the traditional crafts of Iraq. So he's anything but not prolific, as it were. Anyway, let us proceed, but just to remind you that if you have any questions throughout the course of the evening, please put them in the chat box and Alison will then post them to Marcus. Then, okay, enjoy. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples on Vancouver Island, off the western coast of Canada. So it's one of the great things about our modern environment that we can actually connect together for events like this. So I'd like to start by thanking the Islamic Art Circle and the Royal Asiatic Society for the opportunity to do this, and particularly to Rosalind and to Alison for extending this invitation. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about this book. So I'm going to just share my screen now. So I hope you can all see that okay. So I'm going to move forward to the first slide. And I want to start by sort of giving a little bit of background as to how I became interested in this topic. It came about really from a fascination with medieval travel literature. And as many of you all know, there are dozens and dozens of different texts of the travels of particular people through the medieval into the early modern period. And many of them were headed towards the Holy Land, and part of that longer itinerary was often Egypt. And having read through a lot of these texts, one of their fascinations is that, of course, they provide fresh insights that are often not found in the Arabic texts of the same period. That's not to say that they are in any way, it's not to make a value judgment, but rather just to suggest that sometimes they see different things. But of course, one of the great challenges is that they also misunderstand elements that they see. And so one has to untangle these. They also receive what's probably oral testimony, which can be confused and muddled. And then also there's a tendency to privilege prior authority over what sometimes they see with their own eyes. And so they are far from being unproblematic sources, but at the same time, I think they are valuable, and they not just give us sources of information, but also an idea about how people perceived things to be. Now, of course, the other side of that type of travel literature is that it is taken back to Europe, and then it is transmitted in manuscript form, and then from the 15th century onwards in printed form. And so it meant that people who didn't travel could also gain an understanding of what these sorts of sites were like. And when we get into the age of printing, of course, we end up with the production of images which go along with the texts. And so I've chosen this particular one, which is a wonderful map of Cairo. Now, it's based on earlier models, particularly that of Matteo Pagani, which was produced in 1549. But we're looking here at a woodcut from Sebastian Munster's Cosmographia, very popular text printed in numerous editions through the 16th century. Now, it takes a little bit of time to orient oneself with a map like this, but if you start to realize that east is at the top of the map and that west is at the bottom, you can start to get a sense of what's going on. We have the river, the Nile, kind of snaking around the lower part of the image. And then if you look in the bottom corner, you can see the representations of the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx. Maps like this are absolutely full of detail, and so it gives you a sense again of the sort of excitement that perhaps readers would have had, poring over an image like this to try and understand, a huge metropolis like Cairo. And indeed, a city like this would have been bigger than anything else in Europe at the same time. At the top of the map, we see the Citadel of Cairo. So I've just sort of put a couple of details to give you a sense of how much there is within this woodcut image. So if we go to another detail of this, we're now looking at the upper part of the image from the citadel, looking along the walls of Cairo, the great Fatimid city established in 969, and then out into the suburbs. And of course, through the history of Cairo, we see the creation of suburbs outside of walls, as you can see here, and then gradually moving out into the countryside. So what we see in the boxed image is the subject matter of this talk, and we're looking at the site of Matarea. It was located about 5 kilometers northeast of the main part of Cairo. So you can see that the map contracts distance here in order to get more things into it. And along the way, you can see some of the urban center, as well as major constructions such as the Palace of Yashbak. So when we're looking at this, we can correlate what we see with the sort of texts which were written at the same time. Because one of the striking things I found looking at these texts about Cairo was that there are things that every single traveler would go and see. They would see the Nile, they would describe the wildlife that they would see there, the markets of Cairo, they would talk about seeing the citadel. They would also obviously go to the pyramids. And one of the other essential journeys was to go to Matarea, this small walled compound you can see, which has an obelisk next to it. There's a large tree dominating the enclosed area. So what was it about this site which was so fascinating? If we go to, in a sense, the end of our story, here we're looking at a frontispiece, which is from a book of travels by George Sandys, published in 1615, and he actually made his journey through the Eastern Mediterranean down into Cairo around about 1611. And it's in 1611 that he travels in March up towards Matarea. So he sort of takes a horse and rides to the site. And when he's there, he describes the things that are around him. So he describes a tree, and the tree you can see up in the top corner is the Sycamore Fig. Now, the one that you see in the image is one that was planted in the 17th century, actually after Sandy's visit, by the Franciscan fathers. This particular tree stood through into the 20th century, but it was an earlier sycamore fig which was seen by Sandys, and the story was that the gap within it had hidden the Holy Family during the flight to Egypt. So you can see immediately that there are religious connotations here. But after he's described the chapel which existed on the site, the water lifting system that irrigated the gardens, he then says, "But I abuse my time and provoke my reader. In an enclosure adjoining, they showed us a plant of balm, the whole remainder of that store which this orchard produced, destroyed by the Turks or envy of the Jews, as by them reported, being transported out of Jewry in the days of Herod the Great by the commandment of Antonius at the suite of Cleopatra. But others say brought hither out of Arabia Felix at the cost of the Saracen Sultan." So I think in a way this short text kind of gives us a sense of the challenges of travel writing, in that it offers two rather different hypotheses about where these plants come from. And of course it gets at, what's the challenge of trying to understand these plants today? Because in 1615, the date of the publication of this book, the last balsam tree in Matarea died. And as a result, we have obviously a huge challenge in trying to understand what this plant actually was. Was it a whole separate species which is now lost to us? Is it simply a tree which exists in the wild and is known by a different name? Or is it some sort of cultivated strain of a wild plant, which again is now lost to us? So this was a starting point, and I started to collect evidence on the plant and try to understand its cultural relevance for Christians in Europe, as well as for peoples across the Islamic world, and then also think about its ancient history. And I certainly didn't have any idea when I first started working on this how broad that topic would turn out to be. So what I'm hoping to do today is not, sort of focus in on a particular chapter of the book, but rather to just give a very kind of broad overview of some of the themes that I've been trying to work with in this book. And of course, this involves, sort of going through textual history, archaeological evidence, some sort of art historical material. But while there's the challenge of trying to kind of reconstruct the story, the narrative, from say about the 4th century BC through to the 17th century, there's also a kind of bigger question about how value is generated. How is it that something like this comes to be valuable? Is it simply a product of its utility, the various things it can do, and perhaps its rarity, or are there other factors involved? And then also, what can we say about the sense of authenticity, because this product meant that people had to judge it, they had to get a sense of, why is it unique? Why is it only found here? How can we test that? And of course, the way those things are tested is different from the way we might do now, but it does have certain criteria. So what we know about this tree is we have numerous descriptions, and I'll come back to that later on. But one of the crucial elements is that the product which is gathered from it is done from scoring into the bark itself and then gathering the resinous product which is coming from it. And what we're looking at here is what is technically known as an oleoresin. So it's a resin with a high oil content, which also means that it doesn't readily solidify. And again, we'll come back to some of the kind of details later on. But the key point to make, of course, is that resins, plant resins, have been used by people since very ancient times. And perhaps the most famous we can think of is the one we see on the screen here, which is myrrh, which we still see it harvested in Somalia. It is still used for medicinal purposes today. And it's worth bearing in mind that all of these resins, particularly the ones with large amounts of kind of volatile oils that make them aromatic, is that they do have genuine medicinal qualities. They actually can be used as antiseptics, for instance. So not surprisingly, these things were gathered and transported elsewhere. And this trade in plant resins is very important for understanding the economic development of the Arabian Peninsula and then also the Horn of Africa. So if we go back, into ancient texts, we have references to expeditions from Egypt, which was sent to the land of Punt, and there's still a lot of debate as to exactly where Punt was, although it's possible it's Eritrea. And the bringing back of trees, which again could produce resinous, aromatic resinous materials. But when we look at these great sites, as you can see on the map, and I'm showing you kind of a couple of images of the Nabatean capital, Petra, and then the extraordinary city of Sheba in the Wadi Hadramaut in Yemen, that we need to think of these in relation to this trade in resins, which is coming up through the western part of the Arabian Peninsula and ultimately towards the Mediterranean. From there, we know, for instance, that the Roman Empire was a great consumer of these sorts of products, so it goes into Mediterranean trade. We can also think about references in the Old Testament, which talk again about the trade in resins, so we know that it has a very ancient history. Now, within this, there are references to a product called balm of Gilead, and then also another one which is known in Hebrew as Balsam. So balm of Gilead is Zori, and we have Balsam. And there have been attempts to try and link this to balsam. Now, those things are problematic, but certainly we do have an idea about these sort of important products. So what can we actually start to say about the balsam and its cultivation in ancient times? Now, if we go back to Sandys, he talks about the fact that it comes from, or rather it's sort of transported to Egypt at the time of Herod the Great, and he implicates Mark Antony and Cleopatra in that. Now, it's not clear whether that has any historical basis, although it probably comes from reading texts like Josephus and the Jewish Antiquities. But if we look at excavations which have gone on in the region of Jericho and then in En-Gedi, which we'll come back to, there is certainly evidence here for intensive cultivation using hydraulic engineering. So there's sort of the transport of water in order to be able to grow specialized plants. And then also buildings that seem to actually be for the crushing and processing of perfumed plants. Now we can supplement that with textual sources. So the earliest source that actually provides us with a description is the book on plants by Theophrastus from the 4th century before the Common Era. And he actually refers to this plant, and then he also says that it's unknown in the wild. So it would indicate that it was already understood by the 4th century to be a plant which was distinct from any wild plant. We have other very interesting descriptions by Pliny the Elder, and he seems to indicate that there are actually 3 separate strains of balsam, though these don't seem to have survived through into the medieval period, where we seem to be looking at just one. So we have these excavations going on, and then we have other kind of very intriguing evidence, such as this little juglet, which was found in the Qumran caves, which was stoppered up and covered with, or sort of protected with palm leaves. And it contained a resinous material, which was tested and found not to correlate with any known sort of plant or animal oil. Now, that's not to say it's balsam, but it is very striking that it was protected so carefully, so it suggests it's something valuable. From Masada, there are ceramics which actually have inscriptions in Aramaic saying balsam juice on them. So it does suggest that there were balsam containers. And there's been an intriguing suggestion that this 6th century mosaic from Mardaba in Jordan, which is a sort of world map, that you can see palm trees in the area of Jericho, but also these darker plant forms, and that these may in fact be representations of the balsam plant. Now, what we can tell, therefore, is that we actually have balsam cultivation going on in these areas in the Jordan Valley, Dead Sea area, in the times leading up to the Roman campaigns in Palestine. And it's clear that one of the priorities of the Romans was the acquisition of these specialized areas of cultivation. And so there are references to battles going on. And in the period after 70 of the Common Era, we see an expansion of balsam cultivation, which also takes in the area of En-Gedi, and that becomes more important than Jericho. Now, one of the questions is, how long did this go on? We know that the Roman emperor actually had some of these areas under his own personal control, and others seem to have sort of had different types of ownership. But was it the case that balsam was transported to Egypt as suggested by Sandys at the time of Cleopatra? Probably not. But in that case, when was this done? Was it done by Vespasian at the time of the Palestine campaigns? Again, unlikely. And it seems like it occurs later on, because we still have evidence for balsam cultivation in En-Gedi into later periods. And there's this very intriguing inscription on the floor of a synagogue, in amongst which there is a curse laid on anyone who reveals to the Gentiles the secret of the town. And again, there have been suggestions that what this is referring to is the cultivation of balsam. Where we have some better evidence, though, is from the 4th and 5th century. There are textual sources from Egypt that do seem to indicate balsam cultivation is already starting there. So perhaps it's happening at the same time as it's gradually kind of dying out in the area of En-Gedi. But we have very few sources really that kind of tell us what happens in the intervening period. The earliest references to balsam are actually in the sort of region of Alexandria, and it's only later, it would seem, that it finds its way to Matarea. So we'll come back to that part in a moment, but what we do have is, despite the fact we have no plants surviving, we've got a lot of interesting evidence from which we can start to think about what sort of a plant this actually was. Now, I've mentioned some of the textual sources, but we can also, in addition to things like Theophrastus and Pliny, we have a much more detailed inscription, text by Dioscorides in his famous De Materia Medica, his book on pharmacological products. And Dioscorides is particularly useful, and his text was referenced so many times because he gives such a sort of ordered description, not only of the plant, but also of its medicinal qualities. And so we'll come back to that in a moment and how that links up to the idea of humoral medicine. But he tells us about it. It's a small plant. He talks about it having a sort of double bark to it, that it has these sort of rather long, thin leaves, as you can see in the later illustrations as well. And crucially, we see this awareness in the illustration of this Arabic Dioscorides, dates 1083, of the fundamental way in which the product is gathered from it, that is scoring into the bark. Dioscorides gives us information about the fruit of it, the way in which the leaves spring from the branches and so on. So we have these descriptions, but as I say, it leaves open this question of whether this is an extinct species, because what we do have is wild plants which have similar kind of characteristics. So the most important one is known as Commiphora gileadenensis, or sometimes Commiphora obobalsamum. And this grows in the area of Mecca in Western Arabia down into Yemen and then the Horn of Africa. And it produces an oleoresin, which is known today as balm of Mecca. Which again is still sometimes used in sort of popular medicine. But unfortunately, what it doesn't have is the extremely fine scent which balsam is said to have. And balsam was traded for its weight in gold, both as a perfume and also as a medicinal product. The smell of burning Mecca balsam was described as like burning India rubber, so it certainly isn't the kind of attractive scent. So this would suggest that we have something which has been selectively cultivated over centuries in order to make it into a much smaller plant and one capable of generating this fine scent. So Dioscorides remains, a crucial source, not just for this study, but for all types of, pharmacological studies through the medieval period, because it was so often cited and used. And we see one of the fascinations of looking at balsam is that we can see the way in which classical knowledge is finding its way into Islamic medicine and then ultimately into medieval and early modern European medicine. And I won't go into that in kind of huge detail, but these illustrations kind of give a sense of that progression, in that we have the famous De Materia Medica manuscript of Juliana Anicia from 512, produced in Constantinople, and we see the image of Horesis holding the mandrake plant with this very characteristic, humanoid root, and giving it to Dioscorides. And we've got the same sort of an Islamicized version of this, where we have a teacher holding the mandrake and then a student on the other side. Note also the absence of the dog, which is such a crucial part of the classical image. So we've got this transmission of ideas, and of course this will be well known to everybody, the idea of the translation movement. And so knowledge about balsam, finds its way through that mechanism. Not only particular knowledge, but also theoretical knowledge, in that it's all bound up with the idea of the humoral medicine. So balsam is fitted into these categories. So this idea that everything can be broken down into the humours that then lead on to the temperaments, as you can see in this 16th century illustration, and then also to characteristics of moistness, dryness, hot, cold. And the categorization of balsam is crucial to its use in medicine. So it's categorized as being a heating and drying agent. So in other words, in order to bring the body back to balance, if you have an excess of cold or wet within your system, then balsam is going to be something which is going to be used for that purpose. So once you start to realize this, it makes it easier to understand the logic of the types of treatments in which balsam is recommended. Now, again, there's such a massive evidence there that I won't try and attempt that now. But the point is that, we can see all sorts of ailments which were believed to be to do with, sort of an excess of cold, for instance, being treated. Anything which would balsam was seen to be something that could allow you to expel things which were unhealthy within the body. It also has other characteristics which are separate from that humoral realm, in that there's a belief, perhaps because it's a resin, that placing it in something will cause it to be in stasis. So we see that particularly in ophthalmology, in that the idea that a drop of balsam placed into the eye can leave it in its state, or can stop the onset of blindness, cataracts, glaucoma, and so on. This idea of stasis, of course, has another area, in that there's a link to embalming of bodies. And while it turns out that, in fact, there's very little evidence that balsam was used in the embalming of bodies in ancient Egypt, for instance, we do see it coming in early Christian times. And so we do see bodies being treated with balsam. Now, one area of medicine that's sort of worth mentioning is also the place that balsam has in theriacs, in antidotes to poison. And two of the most famous antidotes of the ancient world were Mithridatium, supposedly developed by Mithridates of Pontus, who's been known as the Poison King because of his habit of actually ingesting tiny amounts of poison to make himself immune from them. And then a sort of elaboration of that recipe by Andromachus, the physician of Nero, and this was Galeni. And what we see is actually the theriac of Andromachus, the recipe for that, put in diagrammatic form in this wonderful manuscript, the Kitab ad-Diriac from 1199. And what we see through the sort of medieval times is the popularity of these theriacs, and this also contributed to the trade in balsam. Now, the thing is that balsam can be the resin which is gathered from scoring into the bark, but you can also make other products from the berries and from boiling down the branches. And it's particularly these slightly cheaper versions which were used in commercial theriacs, produced in places like Venice. This was one of the major producers of theriac across Europe, but also there were ones produced in London and a number of other European cities. And there was a great concern with their authenticity, as I've mentioned before. And so we see the creation of these beautiful vessels, but also stamps, which are used to authenticate the products of particular places. So these are, some of the most important dimensions of balsam, and its high value meant that it was also an ideal object for international trade. We see its extensive use also in diplomacy. So going back to, for instance, even the interactions between Charlemagne and the Abbasid Caliph, balsam is one of the products which is actually taken as part of those gifts. And this becomes even more important through the Ayyubid and then into the Mamluk periods. And people like Doris Behrens Abousaif have looked at the diplomatic interactions which go on at that time. And again, we see balsam appearing very regularly. So the last area, and I won't sort of speak for too much longer, but the last area to think about is its use in ritual. We've already seen how it was being produced in the areas of Jericho and En-Gedi. And there's a lot of persuasive evidence to suggest that these were royal compounds, that the cultivation of this plant was a royal preserve. We see it being held later by the Roman emperors, and then, of course, it comes under the control of Muslim rulers. Particularly, our evidence from about the Ayyubid period onwards would suggest that they actually kind of controlled the supply of balsam, even though the cultivation and gathering of the products are often done by Christians. But what we find very little evidence of or direct evidence of, is its use in royal rituals in the ancient world. There are Talmudic sources that talk about the anointing of the Hebrew kings with balsam, but if we go back into the Old Testament sources, we don't see any direct references to that. It's actually rather later that we see those things going on. But one of the other things we need to think about is its role in Christian worship. So under the early Christian fathers, there seems to be very little interest in these sort of perfumed products, perhaps because they were so much a feature of Roman secular life. But once we get through to about 4th, 5th century onwards, we start to see balsam being sent from Egypt to Rome, for instance, for use in rituals. And then it becomes part of the oil of consecration. So I'll show another slide with some more material related to that. But the oil of consecration combines olive oil with perfumed substances, and we see all sorts of medieval texts which talk about the olive oil being the body, and then these perfume products being the spirit. And so balsam was often mixed with other products. So the Catholic Church seems to have gone for a more simple set of recipes, whereas when we go to the Eastern churches, we find, and the Greek Orthodox Church, we find very elaborate recipes where balsam is combined with all sorts of perfumed products, and that the actual cooking of it was, again, bound up with all sorts of rituals. Sadly, we have, no physical elements of these left, except potentially in the Sancta Sanctorum, as you can see on the slides here. Hartmann Grissar, who worked on a number of these objects, talked about the fact that they were encrusted with sort of resinous material, which I presume would be kind of medieval oil of consecration, because icons were often sort of material be applied to them. And he talked about the opening of some of these cabinets where, again, the sort of this very powerful smell would waft out from them. But we then see its introduction into a kind of royal domain. And again, if we look at the earlier evidence, there's a lot of literature about the anointing of the Jewish kings. And I think within Christian kingship, the idea of this sort of Davidic anointing, as you can see in the Theodore Psalter here, where David is being anointed by Samuel, that this was a very attractive idea. It sort of promoted an idea of kingship across Europe. But we have to wait really until the sort of 7th or 8th century before we see evidence of balsam actually being used by particularly Northern European kings in anointing ceremonies. From there, it becomes a sort of essential. And this sets up a really interesting arrangement where these Christian kings need to get hold of this balsam for royal anointing, and yet they have to receive it from the Muslim world through the person of the Sultan. And it was a very valued substance, and so we have references to its use in a variety of different courts. The French court then came up with the idea of creating a celestial oil, and so they had a story about an oil which had been brought down by an angel at the baptism of King Clovis, and then they derided other European rulers for buying their oil in a drugstore. But you can see some of the importance of this anointing in these beautiful objects from the royal collection. The oil container from the 17th century in the shape of a bird, and then this spoon, which is actually the oldest object within the royal collection, dating back to the 12th century. And it was designed specifically for the application of the oil of consecration onto the monarch. And you can see the ridge allows 2 fingers to be kind of drawn through the oil before the bishop then applies it onto the body. So this is just a kind of very kind of brief overview of some of the areas that I've tried to cover in the book. And I think it comes back again to this central idea of value. What we see is that value is something which is created. There are clearly kind of intrinsic qualities to balsam, and yet, if you compare it to myrrh, for instance, and you go through medical texts, myrrh was clearly used in many more types of treatment than balsam. So it's not quite as useful, and yet it was clearly much more valuable. And there we have to start to think about, the action of legend, of, all these associations which are brought to it. And then, of course, its elaboration in various types of ritual, its place in diplomacy, and so on. Lastly, we could think about again, how do they establish the veracity of this balsam? And again, there were alternatives on the market, in the medieval world, and yet Dioscorides and others suggest various tests which could be made to establish whether it is true balsam or not. Whether those would be things that we could think of in scientific terms today is perhaps irrelevant, in the sense that these are things that are meaningful in their particular cultural context. So ultimately, I think this study it gives us a window into how people try to see and understand the world through a very particular product. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I'm sure it's prompted a lot of questions. It certainly has with me. And if you would like to ask a question, please could you use the chat icon at the bottom of the page. Oh yes, sorry, I've got to start my video. I'm sorry. But not connected here. So I just I will just start off. I mean, I was very interested in this production of balsam in Matarea. When is the last time do you think it was produced? When the tree dies? Is that was the balsam? That was the sycamore you mentioned, but that's not the balsam tree.
No, so yes, that's right. There's a sycamore fig tree, and that has these legends around the Holy Family, and then also the water supply there was believed to be miraculously generated by the visit of the Holy Family there. But the balsam trees themselves, we do have references to how they were cultivated, and then also how the oil was tapped from them, and that's a ceremony that certainly during the Mamluk period, the Sultan or sometimes the one of the high officials would actually come and watch this happening, but it would be done by priests from a nearby monastery. Mm-hmm. This seems to kind of continue into the Ottoman period, but one of the difficulties was that in the 1490s there was a lot of instability within the Mamluk world, and the trees in a battle were all destroyed. And it's not until 1501 that, 1501, I think, that there's a sort of an attempt to try and replenish the gardens. But what they then do is they go to Mecca and they gather wild plants there and then start cultivating them. So I think that from that time, it's most likely actually a different tree, in the sense that it's a wild plant rather than this long-term cultivated plant. But I think that they continue to tap the trees. But by the time you get to the early part of the 17th century, there's a whole series of travelers from about the 1590s onwards, and each one records the number of trees, and it's less and less each time. And so my guess is that probably into the early 17th century, they were no longer gathering the oil just because there weren't enough trees to make it worthwhile.
Right. Oh.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, it's. I mean, if did you ever? I mean, I know this probably has no answer, but to determine which plant it was that was so special, because balsam. I mean, I've heard of Himalayan balsam and things, but did you manage to ascertain at all which plant it might be related to? Because you talked about the Meccan balsam being absolutely horrible, smelling like India rubber.
Well, yes, I mean, we can never really be sure unless some actual balsam is found, and it's possible that some early botanical collections may have some samples, or they may find some church that still has some oil or something like that. But from the references, it would suggest Theophrastus, he says that it's unknown in the wild. So I think that what he's telling us is that this is a cultivated strain of a wild plant, which is now sufficiently different that it's not known anywhere else. Pliny, indicates to say those sort of three different types, and then later on, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who's this traveller who goes through Cairo in the 13th century, he actually talks about it being that the oil-producing plant, he suggests there's a sort of male and a female, and that the oil-producing plant is actually sterile and has to be propagated by cuttings. So these are all sort of things, that little clues, and what I think we have is a process by which this Commiphora opobalsamum, this wild plant, is actually made into a kind of smaller plant that through kind of selective cultivation it starts to produce a fine oil. And so the wild plant is the origin, and so probably genetically is very is pretty much it, but its characteristics are very different.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Right, I don't know if we have any questions. Do we have any?
Oh, yes, I can see there's a question about the reference to the Queen of Sheba. Yeah, so so one of the legends is that people, I think, were aware of the fact that neither Egypt nor sort of the Jordan Valley were the places where this plant was indigenous, and so there's no reference to this in the Old Testament. So the visit of the Queen of Sheba in First Kings does talk about the gifts that she brings, but later I think legends are then recorded in Josephus in the Jewish antiquities, and he actually says they say that the root of balsam was brought by the Queen on her visit, and so there's obviously an element in here which is, I mean, there's no reason to suppose she did bring it, because our earliest kind of references to cultivation in these areas go back to about the 6th or 7th century BC and not to the 10th. But this idea that the plant itself comes from southern Arabia, I think is clearly the right evidence or the right idea, and so it's sort of just given this rationale through the figure of the Queen of Sheba.
Right. Now, do we have any other questions? I don't see any. Right. Well, if no one has anything else they would like to say or to ask, I think we can finish there for this evening. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much, Marcus, because that was just such an interesting introduction to your book. And so, of course, I encourage everyone to use the discount and go on to the EUP site, which I have just done tonight, and everything is working. So you can purchase the book from Edinburgh directly. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, to everyone who's attended.
Great, thanks so much. And I saw a number of kind of familiar names in the audience, so greetings to everybody.
Yeah, right.